Well, the Anti-Racism Network South Africa has launched its 7th Anti-Racism Week campaign at Sharpeville, Vereeniging this morning. This is in honor of those who lost their lives during the protest against past laws that led to the massacre. The Action Week coincides with Human Rights Month and aims to create public awareness about racism. Our senior reporter, Griselda Lewis, was there.
This anti-racism launch is bringing together individuals, organizations, as well as emerging youth voices against the scourge of racism, culminating on the 21st of March, which is Human Rights Day in South Africa, but significantly also marks globally as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So the Action Week aims to create public awareness about racism and how it affects on individuals and a broader society. It's also about ensuring that there is a countrywide focus on tackling racism and that it remains on the national agenda. So the program begins here at the Pelindaba Cemetery, where young people, you saw them walking past me in just a few moments. There's another one. They will lay wreaths at the grave sites of those 69 protesters who were killed by the apartheid police. The formal program will also take place at the Sharpeville site, Human Rights Precinct here in Vereeniging, and the anti-racism focus this year will be on racism in schools. You'd remember, Blaine, over the past couple of months, couple of weeks, we've seen quite a number of incidents in Gauteng as well as KwaZulu-Natal, where parents of learners at certain schools had taken to the streets saying that their children are being discriminated against, in particular this being young black learners at some of these institutions. There was one incident in Durban recently, you'd recall, that SABC News had covered, as well as one here in Johannesburg, in Gauteng, where there had been incidents of alleged racism taking place at these schools, where the MECs of these various provincial education departments had to intervene.
All right, let's continue then on this topic that Griselda Lewis is covering then for us. The Anti-Racism Network South Africa is launching a 7th Anti-Racism Week campaign at Sharpeville, Vereeniging today. This is in honor of those who lost their lives during the protest against past laws that led to the massacre. The Action Week, coinciding with Human Rights Month, aims to create public awareness about racism. Let's take this discussion further then. We're now joined by Afrika Tikkun Ceo I Marc Lubnar. A very warm welcome to you, and thank you very much for joining us here on SABC News, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
In discussing the importance of having anti-racism campaigns, when we say we're aiming to create awareness about racism, what exactly do we mean by that? Most are aware of racism, whether we're talking about the victims of racism, and certainly when we're talking about the perpetrators, even though they may plead, some sort of ignorance.
Well, I think one's got to look and say, what's the effect? What's the impact of racism? Because, racism is a dirty word in anybody's language, quite frankly. But what we've got to realize is what's the effects of racism? And if we can realize that to practice racist policies, typically, not only does that necessarily impact those who are on the receiving end of racism, but equally it affects the lives of those who are committing it. Because you're isolating yourself, you're limiting yourself, you're limiting your experiences. I do feel, however, that this issue of racism has taken on a new issue in South Africa, and that's this widening gap between haves and have-nots. So, racism as defined by creed or by color is in fact being overshadowed, I believe, now by this issue, the haves and the have-nots, and the differentiation, the segregation that's taking place between the haves and the have-nots.
Often when we have these sort of awareness campaigns, Mark, on racism, they are often directed at, the victims of racism. How often do we see a situation where those who are perpetrators or potential perpetrators are actually taking part in these sort of campaigns? Because I feel often that it's preaching to the choir, and how does that really help the situation?
You're absolutely right. there has to be a community reaction and response for this to really be effective. You know, there's certainly not enough that's being disclosed in terms of the number of incidences that take place, whether they're subtle incidences that take place or whether they're, you know, public unrest as we're seeing at some of the schools. The issue really has got to be that the communities need to frown upon, needs to be shamed. People need to be shamed if they seem to be committing acts which no longer fit in today's society. We chucked, like when we chucked out apartheid, we made a very strong statement to South Africans that we do not want to live in a segregated, racist environment. So those who still practice that need to realize that they're simply not welcome in today's society.
Yeah, and when we're talking about, sorry, you were breaking, so I thought you'd stop talking there. But when we're talking about the issue of a racism-free South Africa, do you see it as some sort of an illusion, something that we might not actually get to? I mean, realistically, are we really progressing in dealing with matters of racism and certainly confronting our ugly past? I mean, we often are told, you know, leave it in the past, forget about it. But I don't know if you can move on from the from what happened in the past and move on. And you know, it doesn't make sense. You'd have to address the past for you to be able to move forward. And I don't know if we've adequately actually addressed the past. It was a case of, you know, those experiencing racism, the majority being told to, you know, get over it and move on. And so those wounds are still actually essentially there.
It's not only the wounds, it's the social effect and impact that apartheid, the legacy of apartheid. You know, honestly, I do hear a lot of people say, come on, you know, apartheid's 25, 26 years ago, let's move on from that. Most of the youngsters in townships today, for argument's sake, weren't even around during apartheid years. The reality of it is apartheid created social structures which caused distancing between people. And that still exists today. That is the legacy of apartheid. And the poverty, inequality issues are a legacy of apartheid. So you can't just simply say, oh, well, we did away with, we overthrew apartheid and therefore just get on with things. We have to recognize that there are still deep, deep legacies. You know, young individuals, as you know, most of my life is spent involved with township youth. Young individuals still having to travel from Diepsloot to the city of Johannesburg, for argument's sake, to find jobs. Yeah. They've got to come up with 40 every single time they want to go for an interview. That's the legacy of apartheid. Young individuals with parents, you know, as their role models, were domestic workers or shop clerks or shop assistants, but weren't necessarily senior managers, senior executives. You know, the lack of role models, that's the legacy of apartheid that still exists, I'm afraid. And that's going to take a long, long time to necessarily wash through our system. And in the interim, we've just got to be cognizant of that, and we've got to take steps to necessarily, as best, ameliorate the impact that that segregation caused.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, sir. Thanks very much for engaging with us on a very important issue, of course, in our country. Marc Lubnar, thank you.
Just to make one last passing comment.
Sure.
We're if we recognize that our strength lies in being together, being one, then we necessarily can ever be if we differentiate and segment ourselves. So my appeal to all South Africans is let's just look at life together as one South Africa.
Yeah, thanks. Great words to end off with. Marc Lubnar, Afrika Tikkun CEO, talking about anti-racism campaign, it being Anti-Racism Week, and Anti-Racism Network South Africa launching its 7th Anti-Racism Week campaign in Sharpeville, Vereeniging. Well,